My name is Evelyn Mercer. I am 63 years old. For most of my life, I was the chief archivist at Stanford University Library. It was a job I loved, a job that taught me the value of records, of details, of things that most people would call insignificant. I have always believed that stories like people are made up of fragments. And sometimes those fragments are the difference between truth and lies, between dignity and destruction. I am also a widow. My husband Raymond passed away 7 years ago after a long battle with cancer. Since then, my life has grown smaller, quieter. My son Brandon and his wife Claire became my closest family. Or so I believed. The day everything changed started like any other. I was headed to the airport suitcase, already checked ticket in hand, on my way to Portland to spend the holidays at my friend Elaine's lake house. The kind of trip that felt both ordinary and necessary. But as I pulled into the long-term parking lot, I felt it a sudden sharp thought that stopped me cold. I had forgotten something important, the original copy of Raymond's will. Not the photocopy I kept in my desk drawer, the real document. The one with his signature, his notes in the margins. The one I was supposed to bring along because Elaine's husband had offered to help me review some legal updates. I told myself it would only take 5 minutes. I would turn back, grab the folder, and be on my way before the coffee in my travel mug went cold. But what I walked into was something no mother, no human being should ever have to hear. The house was still when I arrived. Too still. I didn't call out. I didn't even drop my keys into the ceramic bowl by the door like I always did. Something in my chest tightened. My breath came shallow without me realizing why. I stepped softly down the hall, my shoes brushing against the wooden floor. That's when I heard it, voices low, deliberate, careful. They came from the study. My study. My fingertips grazed the wall as I paused just beyond the archway. The air smelled faintly of lemon soap and old paper. Familiar. Safe. Until the words began to land. If she's showing signs, we can make the case, a voice said. It was Brandon, my son, my only child. His tone was cold, distant, not the voice I had known when he was a boy with scraped knees and a wild imagination. She's 73. It won't be hard, came Claire's reply. Her voice, always so polished, so soft, suddenly carried a different weight, a sinister edge. With the right filing, diminished capacity can be demonstrated easily, she continued. Ashcroft said it's all about consistency. If we can document a pattern, memory lapses, confusion, misplaced things. The air around me seemed to constrict. I felt my knees weaken, but I didn't make a sound. I pressed my back tighter to the wall. My heart pounded slow and heavy, not from panic, but from something colder. Betrayal. I wasn't supposed to hear this, but I did. And once you hear something like that, you can't unhear it. You can't unknow the way people you love are willing to erase you quietly, efficiently, as if you are an inconvenient piece of furniture that needs to be moved out of the way. Brandon. My Brandon. The boy I raised alone for so many years while working night shifts at the university while Raymond built his modest business. The boy I stayed up with when he was sick, when he was afraid of thunderstorms, when he couldn't sleep unless I hummed the same lullaby over and over again. That boy had become a man I no longer recognized. The words kept coming. I've already started the list, Brandon said. The missed payments, the taxes she forgot last year, the repeated stories. If we present this right, the guardianship will be uncontested. I could barely breathe. Not from anger, at least not yet, but from disbelief. From the slow, horrifying realization that this wasn't sudden. This wasn't spontaneous. This was planned. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I let the conversation burn itself into my memory. Every word, every inflection. My hand trembled around my keys, but I held them steady. When I finally stepped back, I moved like a ghost. Careful not to let the floorboards creak. Careful not to let them know that the illusion of their control had shattered. Because in that moment, something inside me shifted, not broken, Not defeated, but cold, hard, focused. I left the house without making a sound. The sun was still warm outside, but I felt none of it. My breath fogged the windshield as I sat there in the car, motionless, hands on the wheel, heart hollow. I wasn't supposed to hear it, but I did. And I wasn't going to forget it. I don't remember unlocking the car. I don't remember how my hands found the steering wheel or how I managed to pull out of the driveway without crashing into the neighbor's mailbox. What I do remember is the cold. It wasn't the kind of cold that touches your skin. It was the kind that settles deep in your bones, a stillness that doesn't leave even when the sun is shining. I drove without thinking, past the grocery store where Raymond used to buy his favorite cinnamon rolls, past the library where I spent 3 decades cataloging the stories of others while forgetting to write my own. My eyes were open, but I wasn't really seeing. My hands stayed steady on the wheel, but my heart felt like it didn't belong to me anymore. Somewhere along the way, the memories started flooding in. Not in any order, memories rarely arrive neatly. I saw Raymond's face first. His easy smile, the way he'd tip his head when he laughed, the way he always made time for Sunday morning breakfasts, no matter how busy the week had been. He used to say, a life worth living is one where you never forget to sit down for coffee with someone you love. For a moment, I could almost smell the fresh bread and hear the low hum of conversation in that tiny corner bakery we used to visit. The memory felt so real that my hands tightened on the steering wheel as if I could drive back to it, as if I could return to the version of my life where Brandon was still just a boy with scraped knees and endless questions about how the world worked. But that version of him, that version of us, was gone. The real memory that haunted me more than the one from the bakery was how I had let things slip, slowly, quietly, the way erosion happens, one overlooked moment at a time. I remembered when Brandon first insisted on taking over the household finances after Raymond passed. "You don't need to stress about it, Mom," he'd said, flashing that same easy grin he had when he was 8 years old. I remembered the first time he changed our family accountant without asking me. The time he corrected me about the balance on one of the accounts, saying I must have forgotten. And I let it happen. Because that's what we do, isn't it? We tell ourselves that love means trust, that children grow up and take on new roles, and that it's natural to let go. I excused each small shift, each subtle takeover because it felt easier than confrontation. Easier than believing that someone you raised could look at you not with love, but with calculation. The sun was out that morning, bright, unseasonably warm for early December. But inside I felt cold, colder than I could ever explain. I pulled the car into an unfamiliar street engine, idling, my fingertips pressed white against the wheel. I don't know how long I sat there. Time felt both heavy and weightless. The image of Claire's face, so polished, so polite, floated in my mind. The way she had whispered legal terms with surgical precision. As if I were already gone. As if I were an object to be managed. A problem to be solved. A shiver ran through me even though the sun cast golden light across the dashboard. It reminded me of the way winter tricks you, how the sky can glow soft and blue while the wind cuts like glass. I felt like that, lit from the outside, frozen underneath. I thought about turning around, about storming back into that house and demanding answers. But the voice in my head, the same quiet voice that had guided me through every archive, every fragile document, every hidden truth, told me, no, not yet, not like this. I needed to think, to breathe, to remember who I had been before the years of grief and quiet compliance wore me down. So I kept driving, letting the city blur around me, letting the sharp taste of betrayal settle into something sharper, still resolve. I don't know what made me stop in front of that bakery. Maybe it was muscle memory. Maybe it was the part of me that still longed for something familiar, when everything else had come undone. The awning had been replaced, the windows cleaner, the name different. But the The smell was the same: warm cinnamon, toasted almonds, a hint of melted butter that clung to the air like a gentle hand on my shoulder. I parked without thinking, stepped inside, and found myself adrift in another life. I hadn't been here in decades. Not since Raymond and I were still living in that cramped 2-bedroom apartment near Union Street, before Brandon was old enough to carry the weight of his own name. Back then, every Sunday without fail, Raymond would bring me here, rain or shine. We'd sit by the window, share a croissant or a muffin, sip coffee from thick ceramic mugs, and talk about everything and nothing. I chose the same seat by the window, though the chairs were newer now, the tables sleeker. I wrapped my hands around a cup of coffee more for the warmth and the taste, and watched the people pass by outside heads, down coats zipped, moving quickly through a world that no longer felt mine. The ache in my chest was sharp but quiet, a kind of mourning not just for Raymond, but for the version of myself I seemed to have misplaced. Somewhere between the endless grief, the dutiful mothering, the slow erosion of autonomy, I had let pieces of myself slip through the cracks. And I remembered clear as the frost on the windowpane Raymond's voice one afternoon long ago, when I was doubting myself over some trivial workplace decision. He had looked at me, his hand resting gently on mine, and said, "Don't let anyone define you, Evie. Not even me." I smiled at the memory, but it burned too, because I had let myself be defined by widowhood, by motherhood, by the slow, subtle manipulation of people who claimed to love me. I sipped the coffee. It was bitter, but the bitterness felt honest, real. My eyes drifted down to the small scratch on the tabletop, a tiny mark easily missed, easily dismissed, but it triggered something. A memory of Raymond leaning over our old kitchen table with papers spread out in front of him, circling figures in pencil, writing little notes in the margins. He always said the numbers told the real story, the rest was just noise. That memory struck me like cold water. The will, the annotations, the details I had long overlooked because I trusted Brandon to handle them. I set the cup down carefully, my heart steadying in my chest. Something clicked into place. Not a full picture, not yet, but the edges of something real. Something I could follow. I wouldn't go back to the airport, I wouldn't call Elaine, I wouldn't run. Not this time. I finished half the coffee, left a tip on the table, and stepped back into the cold. The parking lot behind the library was nearly empty when I arrived. The winter sky had begun to fade into that soft, pale gray, and for the first time in days, my hands felt steady. This was the place where I had spent the best years of my life, not just working, but building something, preserving history, giving a voice to stories that might otherwise be lost. I let myself into the building, nodding politely to the young woman at the front desk, who thankfully didn't ask questions. The moment I crossed the threshold of the archives room, I felt it, that familiar calm, the scent of old paper and dust of ink and varnished wood. It wrapped around me like an old coat. The overhead lights still flickered slightly when you looked at them too long. The filing cabinets were the same. I moved without hesitation. My fingers knew the path before my mind did. The drawer slid open with a soft click, and there it was, the folder, thick worn, labeled in Raymond's careful hand. I carried it to the corner table, sat down, and exhaled, slowly, deliberately. The will was there untouched, the original. But more importantly, the annotations. Raymond's shorthand, his tiny arrows, his clip notes in pencil, covered the margins like a private language only we shared. One note caught my eye immediately. A small yellow sticky tab near the back of the file. The handwriting faded, but unmistakable read, "If you ever feel unsure, the answer is always in the numbers." My heart tightened. I flipped to the corresponding page, a detailed breakdown of assets, properties, investments, bond accounts. Next to each item were 2 sets of initials D to retain, D or G under review, and then crucially scrawled next to the largest asset, not G, to manage, legal hold unless independent review. Confirm with Marjorie if uncertain. Marjorie. He had written it down. He had known. I sat there for a long moment, tracing my fingertips along the edges of the paper. I could almost hear Raymond's voice again. Not the voice weakened by illness, but the one that had steadied me through every major decision of my life. I pulled a notepad from my bag, the same one I used to carry during field work, and I began to make a list. First, make certified copies of everything. Second, contact Marjorie. Third, initiate independent audit on accounts. I underlined each item with slow, even pressure, the way I used to when verifying historical documents, when the stakes were facts, not feelings, when truth mattered more than convenience. When I finally stood and slid the folder back into my bag, the weight felt different, not heavier, sharper, like a compass needle finally set in the right direction. I walked out of the archives room without looking back. The sun was gone now, the sky a soft navy. My breath misted in the air as I reached the car, but I no longer felt the cold the way I had that morning. I wasn't lost, I wasn't broken, and I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. By the time I got home that evening, the weight of what I had uncovered sat heavy on my chest. The folder from the library was tucked neatly in my bag, but it felt like I was carrying something far heavier, something I wasn't sure I could hold on my own. I poured myself a cup of tea I didn't drink, sat at the kitchen table and stared at the phone for a long while. My fingers hovered above the screen. For a moment I felt foolish, paranoid even. But then I remembered Brandon's voice, Claire's carefully chosen words, the cold detachment in both their tones. And I knew I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't being dramatic. This was real. I scrolled until I found her name, Marjorie Hayes. We hadn't spoken in nearly 5 years. Life has a way of pulling even the closest friends into separate orbits, but some people remain rooted in the foundation of who you are. Marjorie was one of them. When she answered, I didn't waste time. Marjorie, I said quietly, I need help. Legal help. It's personal. There was the briefest pause, and then her voice, steady, low, familiar, came through the line. Where and when, I exhaled. My house. Tomorrow if you can. Her answer came without hesitation. I'll be there by 4. Don't worry, Evie. We'll do this the right way. We'll do it your way. I hung up and let the silence return. But for the first time in days, the silence didn't feel so empty. When Marjorie arrived the next afternoon, she looked exactly as I remembered. Navy wool coat, silver hair pulled into a tight knot, eyes sharp as ever. She didn't offer false comfort. She didn't ask needless questions. She stepped inside, set her briefcase down, and said quietly, "Show me." I slid the recorder across the table. The folder from the library. The sticky note with Raymond's handwriting. I didn't speak until I had finished laying out every piece. She listened, watched, took notes without breaking her rhythm. When the recording finished, Brandon's voice, Claire's calculated whispers, she didn't flinch. She simply leaned back and folded her hands. We're going to fix this, she said. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed her. The next morning, as Marjorie and I sat together over coffee, she asked if Raymond had ever shared additional financial details beyond the will. Something separate. Something private. Her question struck something dormant in me. A name surfaced, Alan Reed, an old friend of Raymond's. More than that, his former business partner and financial advisor before the company sold its last division. I remembered how in the months before his death, Raymond had mentioned leaving a backup with Alan in case anything ever went wrong. Alan was someone I hadn't seen since the funeral. We had exchanged polite condolences, and then, like most acquaintances do after grief drifted apart. Marjorie's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. If there's another document, something Raymond kept off the official record, it could change everything. I hesitated, then reached for my old address book, one of the few things I never transferred to digital. Alan's name was still there, written in Raymond's handwriting. I called the number fully expecting it to be disconnected, But it rang. Alan Reed speaking. His voice was older, rougher around the edges, but undeniably him. I introduced myself softly. There was a pause. Then he exhaled sharply. Evelyn. I was wondering when you'd call. The weight of those words landed in my chest. Raymond mentioned he left something with you. Yes, he said. He did. And I still have it. A sealed envelope. He made me promise not to release it unless you specifically asked for it. I haven't touched it. I closed my eyes. Can I come see you? He hesitated. You can. But Evelyn? Be careful. When money tangles with blood, people change. They're not who you think they are. I swallowed. I know. We arranged to meet the following afternoon. I hung up my hand, still shaking slightly. Marjorie looked at me. Good, she said softly. One more piece of the puzzle. I wasn't sure if the tremor in my chest was fear or something closer to hope. The next time Brandon came to the house, I was ready. I had tucked the small voice recorder into the lining of my cardigan, a trick I learned from my years interviewing donors for the archives. Discreet, unobtrusive. The red light blinked once, then disappeared. He arrived with a bouquet of supermarket tulips, yellow, and a paper bag with soup bread and chocolates. He smiled the way he used to when he was little and caught stealing cookies before dinner. I let him in, quietly, calmly. I offered no hint that anything had changed. The house was chilled deliberately. I had left the heating low, the mail unopened on the table, a crossword puzzle half completed beside an uncapped pen. Tiny details, subtle signals. We sat together at the kitchen table. He unpacked the groceries, moving around my kitchen like it was his own. I kept my hands wrapped around an empty tea mug, letting my fingers tremble just slightly. How have you been sleeping, Mom? He asked gently, his eyes scanning the calendar on the fridge, the pill organizer by the sink. I smiled faintly. Some nights are better than others. He nodded, his face the perfect mask of concern. I've been thinking. It might be good to have someone check in once or twice a week, just to help out. I blinked, let my gaze drift out the window. That might be nice, I murmured, to have someone help with the cooking. He smiled, his eyes lit with quiet relief. The trap was being set. He moved closer, his voice softening. I've also done some research. There's a wonderful care community nearby. Gardens, music therapy, staff trained in memory support. It's not about giving up independence. It's about making sure you're comfortable. I let my fingers fumble slightly with the edge of the napkin. That sounds lovely, I whispered. What day is it today? The question was deliberate, small, harmless on the surface. But I saw the flicker in his expression. Satisfaction, confirmation. He told me the date. I smiled. We sat in silence for a while. He packed up the dishes, offered to take out the trash, and kissed my cheek on his way out. The door closed softly behind him. I sat perfectly still. My hands didn't shake. I reached for the recorder, stopped the recording, and labeled the file in my head, Visit Brandon. Assisted living discussion. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even afraid. I was recording. I was documenting. I was beginning. Alan's house sat at the edge of the old district, quiet, unassuming, the kind of place where people still wave to their neighbors. He greeted me at the door with a nod. No unnecessary words, just a gesture toward the living room, where a small fire burned low in the grate. He moved slower than I remembered, but his eyes were still sharp. I sat down on the worn leather chair across from him, hands resting on my lap. The folder was already on the coffee table, a simple manila envelope with my name written in Raymond's handwriting. Alan poured 2 cups of tea. We didn't speak until he sat across from me, leaning forward, elbows on knees. Before I give you this, he said softly, you need to understand. Raymond trusted me to hold it because he knew sometimes the people closest to us aren't who we believe them to be. I swallowed hard, nodding. He slid the envelope toward me. I took it with both hands. The weight was negligible. The contents were not. "Brandon and Claire," he said, voice low. "They've used your name, Evelyn. Your signature. They opened an investment account 6 months after Raymond passed using your identity." I felt the breath leave my lungs. For a moment I could only stare at him. How Alan's face darkened. "They had access to your personal information. Enough to forge authorization. The account pulls small amounts from the Mercer family trust. Just under thresholds that would trigger alerts. Very quiet. Very careful." I blinked. My heart thudded against my ribs, not from panic, but from the cold weight of confirmation. "And the funds I asked," my voice barely audible. "Offshore-linked investments," he said. "Shell corporations. Claire's fingerprints are all over it. She's done this before Raymond suspected as much, but he never had the proof." I pressed my fingertips together to stop them from shaking. Why didn't he tell me? Alan's eyes softened. "He didn't want to burden you. He thought he had more time to clean it up himself." I closed my eyes for a moment. The fire crackled softly in the background. I could almost hear Raymond's voice in my mind, steady, measured, always the one to carry the heavier load. Alan reached for another folder. "Here," he said gently, "copies of the account details, transaction history, enough to prove misuse of identity. But more importantly," he tapped the top page, "enough to show premeditation. It wasn't an accident." I exhaled slowly, hands tight around the envelope. The betrayal felt heavier now, not just an act of legal manipulation, but something darker. A theft of trust, of memory, of legacy. I thought back to every moment I had doubted myself. Every time Brandon had corrected me about dates, about numbers, about small details. How easily I had let myself believe I was slipping when the truth was, someone had been rewriting my reality all along. Alan's voice broke through my thoughts. "I can testify if you need me to," he said quietly. "I kept copies. I followed protocol. And I owe that to Raymond." I met his gaze steady now. "Thank you," I whispered. "I don't know what comes next, but I'm not going to let them erase me." He nodded. "I know." We sat in silence for a few minutes. The kind of silence that isn't empty but full, layered with the weight of history, regret, and quiet determination. When I finally stood tucking the folder into my bag, the cold outside no longer felt sharp against my skin. Something inside me had begun to harden, not with bitterness, but with purpose. The sun was setting when I pulled away from Alan's house, casting the sky in deep amber and violet. I thought about the account, the deception, the faces I thought I knew. And I promised myself out loud inside the stillness of my car that I would bring it all into the light, every last piece of it. Marjorie arrived the next morning just as the first light broke across the horizon. She carried her laptop, a leather folder, and that same quiet focus I had always admired in her. We didn't waste time on small talk. The weight of what we were unraveling didn't leave space for anything but precision. We sat at the kitchen table side by side. Marjorie's fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, her eyes narrowing as she scanned through records, property filings, email headers I didn't even understand. And then she stopped. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "It's not Brandon," she murmured. "At least not entirely." I turned to her sharply. "What do you mean?" She adjusted her glasses and pointed to the screen. "Look at this. Every major decision, every transfer, every legal move, it all traces back to Claire. The accounts are in Brandon's name, yes, but the directives, the signatures of approval, the consultations with Ashcroft, they're hers." I felt something cold bloom in my chest. "She's the one pulling the strings." Marjorie nodded. "It's classic. Keep the family face clean while the real decisions happen from the sidelines. She's not just complicit, Evelyn. She's the architect." The words settled over me like a lead blanket. Architect. I thought back, scenes flickering through my mind with new clarity. Claire suggesting we switch to her family's accountant after Raymond died. Claire organizing the estate paperwork, volunteering to handle the heavy lifting while Brandon played the devoted son. Claire gently correcting me when I mixed up dates or details. Every kindness, every smile weaponized. My breath caught. Brandon, he doesn't see it. Does he? Marjorie's voice softened. He's compromised, emotionally and legally. She's built this around him, but he's the perfect shield. If it goes wrong, he takes the fall. I press my fingertips to my temples. The betrayal deepened not just because they were stealing from me, but because they were dismantling the very idea of who I thought they were. She has Ashcroft, Marjorie added. A private firm. He's the one advising on guardianship, on asset protection. I pulled his name from legal databases. He's been disciplined before. Gray area ethics. Always just clean enough to stay in business. I let out a shaky breath. The air felt heavier somehow, the room smaller. I thought Brandon was the one I had to confront, I whispered. Marjorie placed her hand over mine. You will, but you need to see this for what it is. Claire is the mind behind it. Brandon is a participant. But the strategy, that's her. I nodded, my throat tightening. The pieces clicked into place the way Claire had always seemed, just slightly too polished, slightly too calm. How she had drifted through our family moments like a spectator, while slowly moving the board beneath us. What do we do? I asked, my voice steady but low. Marjorie's eyes met mine. We build the case. Slowly. Thoroughly. You don't confront them until you have every piece locked down. And when you do, you don't blink. I closed my eyes for a moment, drawing in a deep breath. The Evelyn I had been a week ago, the quiet, compliant woman who trusted blindly, was slipping away. In her place was someone else. Someone Raymond would have recognized. Someone who understood that strength sometimes comes softly, and that survival is built one careful step at a time. When I opened my eyes, the sun had risen a little higher. The light fell across the table, soft gold against the hard truth we had uncovered. It wasn't just Brandon. I was standing in the shadow of someone far more dangerous, and I was no longer afraid. I didn't plan on finding it. That's the truth. I wasn't looking for anything more than a moment of quiet, a moment to breathe. After Marjorie left, I felt as if every corner of my life had become sharp, every object, every memory, every room, holding something I hadn't yet seen clearly. I found the letter while sorting through the back of my closet, behind a row of winter coats I hadn't worn in years. There was an old cardboard box, dusty, brittle at the edges. The word Raymond was scrawled on the side in black marker, his handwriting sharp and deliberate the way he always wrote when he was thinking through something important. I sat down on the floor cross-legged like a child and opened the lid. Inside were scraps of our life postcards from the years before Brandon was born, faded photographs of places we'd never gotten around to visiting, and then tucked between two travel brochures, a single folded page. No envelope, no markings, just a letter. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded it. The paper was soft with age, the ink slightly smudged but still readable. And then, as I scanned the first few lines, my breath caught in my throat. It was his handwriting, his voice on the page, a message I hadn't known existed. If the day ever comes, it began when our son makes you doubt yourself, trust your instinct. You have always seen clearer than you believe. I read the words again and again. The ink blurred as tears rose unbidden to my eyes. The first time I had truly let myself cry in what felt like years. He knew. Not the details, not the specifics. But somehow Raymond had seen the possibility, had understood, long before I did, that love doesn't always shield us from harm. That sometimes the people we raise can become strangers, or worse, adversaries. I pressed the paper to my chest, the tears sliding down without my permission. For a few long minutes, I let myself feel it all. The grief, the exhaustion, the betrayal, the smallness of standing alone in a house that once held laughter and now held only shadows. But then slowly I steadied. I folded the letter with deliberate care, smoothing the creases as I tucked it back into the box. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my sweater. The tears didn't make me weak. The sorrow didn't unmake me. It was a release, not a surrender. I stood the weight in my chest, shifting from despair to something else, something firmer, something. Resilience. I had spent too many years letting myself be defined by what others needed from me as a wife, a mother, a widow. But here in this quiet room, I felt something I hadn't touched in years, the edge of who I used to be. I retrieved the letter one more time and carried it to my desk. I slid it into a folder alongside the other documents Marjorie and I had gathered: the financial records, the forged account, the transcripts. I labeled it carefully, not just as evidence, but as a reminder. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't losing my grip. I was remembering who I was. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept without the hallway light on. The house still creaked in the cold. The wind still brushed against the windows. But the silence no longer felt like a threat. It felt earned, chosen. I knew what was ahead. I knew Brandon would return. I knew Claire wouldn't stop easily. But I also knew something they didn't. I wasn't the same woman they thought I was, and I wouldn't be erased. Not this time. The next morning, Marjorie returned as promised, her briefcase in hand, and determination etched across her face. There was no hesitation between us now, no room for small talk or sentimentality. We both knew what needed to be done, and we both knew that time was no longer on our side. We cleared the dining table and spread everything out. Every piece of evidence, every document, every scrap of truth that had been buried beneath years of polite deception. The original will sat at the center, Raymond's careful handwriting in the margins, his annotations like a quiet whisper from the past. Beside it, the printed transcripts of the conversations I had recorded with Brandon, his voice soft and rehearsed, talking about care homes' memory lapses and the best thing for everyone. I read each line without flinching now. I wasn't hearing my son. I was hearing strategy, cold and calculated. Marjorie's laptop glowed softly as she reviewed the financial records. Alan had provided evidence of the hidden investment account Claire had orchestrated, siphoning funds quietly, methodically under my name. Each transaction, each signature, each date meticulously logged. We placed Raymond's forgotten letter on top. The words I had read in the quiet of my bedroom just the night before still echoed in my mind. Trust your instinct. He had known. Somehow, he had known. Marjorie slid a final document across the table, a formal legal declaration revoking all prior power of attorney rights Brandon held. She handed me the pen. I signed it. The sound of the pen moving across the paper was almost too loud in the stillness of the house. This, Marjorie said softly, is your line in the sand. I nodded, my hands steady. What's next? She leaned back, scanning the files. We'll have everything notarized by tomorrow. Then we file the changes through the proper channels. Local court, estate management, state health services. Claire and Brandon won't be able to act without triggering legal pushback. I breathed in, slowly absorbing each word like oxygen. And if they try anyway? Marjorie's expression sharpened. Then we escalate. But Evelyn, she paused, her voice lowering. You need to be ready. They'll push back. Hard. I didn't hesitate. I'm ready. We worked through the afternoon, organizing each piece of the puzzle into a clean, ironclad sequence. Every document had a backup. Every recording was labeled, time-stamped, and encrypted. The letter from Raymond was scanned, printed, and filed, not because it was legally binding, but because it was the heart of the matter, the reason I refused to back down. As Marjorie typed up the final summary, I sat across from her, reading through the statements she had prepared, lines I would need to speak aloud when the confrontation came. Words like, I have maintained full cognitive capacity, as verified by my physician. My financial decisions remain solely mine-free from undue influence. I revoke all prior powers of attorney and assert full autonomy over my estate. I read them aloud over and over until my voice no longer trembled. Each sentence felt foreign at first, like slipping into clothes that didn't quite fit. But with repetition, something shifted. The words became mine, the strength behind them real. Marjorie looked up at me and smiled faintly. "You're getting there." I allowed myself a small breath of relief. I never thought I'd have to rehearse my own life. Her expression softened. Sometimes we do. Sometimes we forget that survival isn't just breathing. It's standing up when others try to write you out. The words stayed with me. As the afternoon faded into early evening, we packed the folders into 2 separate briefcases, one for me, one for her. We burned temporary files from her laptop, wiped the devices clean, and backed everything onto encrypted drives stored in separate locations. Before she left, Marjorie placed a hand on my shoulder. "This is the hard part, Evie," she said gently. "The waiting. But you're not alone in this." I nodded, my throat tight. "Thank you for not letting me fall apart." She smiled. "You never would have fallen apart. You just forgot for a little while how strong you've always been." When the door closed behind her, I sat in the living room, the house bathed in the soft glow of a single lamp. The folders rested on the coffee table, but they no longer felt like chains. They felt like armor. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and whispered the words again, this time just for myself. I revoke, I assert, I refuse. And for the first time since this began, I didn't feel like I was playing defense. I felt like I was preparing to win. Brandon arrived without calling. I heard the familiar sound of tires crunching on gravel, the soft creak of the front gate, and then the knock, gentle, almost hesitant. I stood at the window for a moment, watching him adjust the folder under his arm, his shoulders drawn tight. There was no warmth in his posture, no ease in his movements. The mask of concern was still there, but thinner now. Tension rippled beneath it. I opened the door and stepped aside. "Come in," I said softly, my voice even. I offered no surprise, no suspicion, only calm. He hesitated, but nodded, stepping inside with a polite smile. "Brought some paperwork," he murmured, holding up the folder. I motioned toward the kitchen. "Let's sit." The house was filled with the gentle scent of warm cider. I had left it on the stove deliberately. The table was clear, except for a single folder resting at its center. My hands were steady as I poured 2 cups, placing one in front of him, before I took my seat across the table. Brandon remained standing for a moment longer, glancing around as if searching for something, some clue, some shift he hadn't anticipated. Finally, he sat, placing his own folder beside mine. He started softly. "I heard from Ashcroft," he said. "There seems to be some confusion about the estate paperwork." I nodded. "I know." He blinked. "You know, I reached for the folder without hurry, opened it. One by one, I slid the documents across the table, each carefully arranged, each as deliberate as the steps I had taken to get here. First, the notarized revocation of power of attorney. Second, the updated will. Third, the physician's letter affirming full cognitive capacity. Last, the transcripts, the printed words of his own voice. Brandon's hands twitched as he scanned the pages, but he didn't touch them. His eyes moved from line to line, his expression shifting, first confusion, then something closer to disbelief. "I don't understand," he said, voice low. I met his gaze without blinking. "I think you do." He swallowed. The color drained slightly from his face. "Mom, this isn't what it looks like." I allowed the silence to stretch between us, let it fill the space without rushing to fill it. Finally, I spoke softly but clearly. "Not all silence," I said, "is weakness." The words hung in the air like fine glass. Fragile, but sharp enough to cut. Brandon's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to speak, but then closed it again. His eyes drifted toward the hallway as if looking for something, someone. But there was no rescue here. No stage for performance. Just the truth laid bare document by document. He shifted in his seat. "I just wanted to make sure you were safe," he murmured. But the words fell flat, lifeless, unconvincing even to his own ears. I placed both hands flat on the table. "I am safe," I said quietly. "I am clear. I am capable. And I am no longer willing to be managed." The line was deliberate, practiced, but by now it felt natural, like an old song I'd once known by heart. Brandon sat still, his fingers flexing slightly on the folder he had brought. He didn't open it. He didn't even try to. Instead, he exhaled slowly and stood without a word. I didn't move. He gathered his things, papers untouched, coffee untouched, and made his way to the door. He paused once, hand on the knob, and turned halfway as if to speak. But whatever words had been prepared dissolved. He left the way he came, quiet, measured, but with the barest hint of something cracking beneath the surface. When the sound of the engine faded down the street, I reached beneath the napkin holder and stopped the recorder I had hidden there. The file was complete, the moment preserved. I labeled it in my mind: quiet confrontation, full clarity. I sat there for a long time, hands resting calmly in my lap, heart steady. There had been no shouting, no rage. Just the slow, careful reclaiming of a life that had nearly slipped through my fingers. I wasn't erased, and I never would be. I watched from the window as Brandon's car pulled away, the tires rolling slowly over the gravel, until the sound vanished into the distance. The house felt unnervingly still in the aftermath. No raised voices, no slammed doors, no final words. Just quiet. I stood there for a long moment, the weight of everything pressing against my ribs. Not panic, not relief, but something colder, something sharper. The fragile illusion I had clung to for so long had finally shattered, leaving behind not a sense of victory, but the raw, unvarnished truth. I wasn't angry. That surprised me more than anything. I wasn't shaking with rage or suffocated by heartbreak. What I felt was a strange kind of steadiness, like stepping onto solid ground after drifting too long at sea. The mask had slipped. Not just his, mine too. I returned to the kitchen, carefully gathering the documents we had laid out, stacking them with deliberate precision. The revocation of power, the affidavit of capacity, the letter from Raymond. Each page felt heavier than paper, each word etched now into the bones of my memory. I slid them into the folder, closed it, and set it aside. It was done. The legal framework that Brandon and Claire had once controlled was no longer theirs to manipulate. Whatever they had planned, whatever story they had told themselves about me was finished. But I didn't feel triumphant. I felt exposed. I sat down at the table, my hands resting lightly on the wood. The recorder still lay beside me, its small red light dark now, but the weight of its presence lingered. Every word Brandon had spoken was there, captured, preserved evidence, not just for the courts, but for myself. Proof that I hadn't imagined any of it. And yet the emptiness in the room was suffocating. I thought about the boy he once was, the child, with wide eyes and endless questions, who used to fall asleep on my chest, with the softest breath against my neck. I thought about the man who had once grieved beside me when we buried Raymond, whose hand had trembled as we let go of the only person who had ever held our family together. I thought about how far we had drifted from that place. How far he had drifted from me. The weight in my chest wasn't bitterness. It wasn't even betrayal. It was the simple, quiet grief of seeing something clearly for the first time, of knowing that no matter what happened next, the shape of us mother and son had been altered beyond repair. I exhaled slowly and stood. I placed the recorder in the drawer, closed it gently, and turned off the light. The night outside was still and dark, the sky a quiet expanse of navy and silver. I had taken back what was mine. I had drawn the line, but the cost was real, and the silence, once so terrifying, had become the only thing that told the truth. News has a way of traveling faster than you ever expect. I hadn't told many people. Marjorie and I had been deliberate, careful, private. But by the following week, whispers began to surface quiet at first, then louder, weaving through the cracks of this small town the way gossip always does. Some neighbors approached me with kind eyes and soft voices. They offered casseroles and apologies, shaking their heads at what they'd heard. "We can't believe Brandon would do that," one woman murmured, her voice heavy with sympathy. "You were always the heart of this community." I thanked them, smiled softly, accepted their kindness. But not every voice was gentle. One morning, tucked beneath the edge of my front doormat, I found an envelope. No return address, no signature, just my name scrawled in thick black ink. I brought it inside with shaking hands and opened it at the kitchen table. The words were sharp, precise, cruel. "I don't know what game you're playing," it read, "but everyone can see you're not well." It's sad, really. Sad to watch someone your age clinging to things that aren't yours to control. Maybe it's time to let go before you embarrass yourself further. I stared at the page for a long while. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the intent was clear. Not every neighbor believed me. Not every friend was truly a friend. And some hidden safely behind paper and anonymity were willing to say aloud what others only thought silently, that maybe I was the problem, that maybe I really was losing my mind. I folded the letter and placed it gently in the drawer beside the recorder. I didn't cry. I didn't react. Instead, I thought about how easy it is for people to doubt a woman who chooses not to disappear quietly. How easy it is to brand her unwell, unhinged, unworthy of her own story. But I knew the truth, and I had the proof. Over the days that followed, I heard both kinds of whispers, the ones that lifted me and the ones that sought to pull me under. I responded to neither. I let the town talk. I let the judgment rise and fall the way it always does, knowing that time would do what time always does, reveal. Not every battle requires a sword. Some are won by standing still. The last time I saw Brandon, his eyes were hollow. It happened 3 weeks after the confrontation, long enough for the legal changes to take full effect, long enough for the cracks to reach the surface. The guardianship petition was quietly withdrawn. The hidden accounts were flagged for investigation. Claire disappeared. Word came through mutual acquaintances that she had packed her things overnight. No note, no forwarding address, just gone. Brandon left to face the consequences alone, unraveled in slow motion. I hadn't sought out the details, but they found me nonetheless. His work with the real estate firm gone. A quiet dismissal. His name stripped from the client rosters without fanfare. The same people who had once toasted his deals no longer returned his calls. One afternoon, a letter arrived. No phone call, no email, just ink on paper. I recognized his handwriting immediately. "Dear Mom, I don't know where to begin. I know I have no right to ask for anything, not forgiveness, not understanding. But I need you to hear me. I was wrong. About everything. I let her convince me that it was about helping you. About protecting you. I told myself it was out of love. But the truth is, I let greed slip in where love should have stayed. And now, I've lost everything. I'm not asking you to reply. I'm not asking you to forget. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For all of it. Brandon, I read it twice, then a third time. My fingers brushed the edge of the paper, tracing the familiar loops of his signature. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. Instead, I set the letter down beside the others, alongside Raymond's note, alongside the legal filings, alongside every other fragment of this strange, painful journey. I thought about the boy. He had once been the one who used to hold my hand, when crossing the street, the one who used to fall asleep in the back seat on long drives home. And then I thought about the man he had chosen to become. I didn't respond, not out of anger, not out of cruelty, but because some fractures, are too deep for words to mend. Instead, I stood by the window that evening as the sun set warm light spilling across the floor, the air still and quiet. I felt no triumph, no bitterness, only a quiet certainty that I had survived it, that I had drawn the line, that I had not disappeared. The wind rustled through the trees outside. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The house, for all its silence, felt like mine again. I whispered softly to no one but myself, "I am still here." And I meant every word. The first morning in the new house, I woke to the sound of waves, soft, steady, unhurried. The house itself was small, a weathered cottage tucked just beyond a narrow stretch of beach. The windows were old, the floors uneven, but there was something about it that felt honest. The kind of place where time slows down, where the past isn't erased but gently set aside. I stood by the window watching the tide roll in and out the sky painted soft lavender and gray. My hands curled around a chipped ceramic mug, the smell of chamomile rising warm against the salt air. For the first time in what felt like years, I didn't feel the weight of someone else's expectations pressing down on me. I was no longer the widow trying to hold together what was already gone. I was no longer the mother being pulled beneath the tide of someone else's ambition. I was simply Evelyn. The boxes were few, only the essentials. A few books, framed photographs. The folder containing the legal documents remained locked in a drawer, no longer the centerpiece of my life, but still there, a quiet reminder of how close I had come to losing everything. It was Tessa who appeared at my door just after noon, Marjorie's daughter. She had always been soft-spoken, but there was a quiet intelligence in her eyes that reminded me of the version of myself I used to know. She brought tea, and cookies she claimed were terrible. They weren't. We spent the afternoon unpacking the last of the boxes. Tessa found an old photo album, its corners frayed with time. She asked gently if I wanted to go through it, and I nodded, lowering myself onto the faded couch. Page by page, memory by memory, we moved through my life. There was Raymond grinning beneath the weight of an oversized Christmas tree. There was Brandon, chubby-cheeked and wild-eyed, his hands covered in cake frosting. There I was, too smiling without realizing it. The lines around my eyes not yet formed the weight of the world still distant. Tessa smiled softly as she turned the pages. "You've lived a lot of life," she whispered. I felt something swell in my chest. Not sorrow, not quite nostalgia, but something steadier. Something like gratitude. "I have," I said quietly. "More than I sometimes remember." The afternoon light shifted the sky outside, glowing gold against the horizon. We boxed up the photos carefully, Tessa adding little labels to the spines. When she left, I stood for a long time at the door, watching her car disappear down the winding coastal road. The house hummed with silence, but it no longer felt like an absence. It felt chosen. I made tea. I lit a candle. And I sat by the window, letting the sound of the sea carry me forward into a future that for the first time in years was entirely mine to shape. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't hiding. I was home. The journal sat open on the kitchen table, a fountain pen resting across the page. I had started writing again, small entries, at first fragments of thought, half-formed sentences. But over time, the words began to come more easily, like water finding its way back to the riverbed. I wrote about the wind, the sound of the waves, the quiet joy of waking up without dread curled in my chest. And then, carefully, deliberately, I wrote about Brandon. I wrote not with bitterness, not with anger, but with the soft ache of someone who has chosen to look the truth in the eye and still extend grace. I wrote I no longer carry hatred for him, only sadness and distance, and the quiet understanding that sometimes love alone is not enough to save someone from themselves. The words felt honest. I thought often about the choices that had brought us here, his mind Claire's. I thought about the invisible threads that had once connected us as family, how thin they had stretched, how easily they had snapped. And still I could not hate him. I could mourn the loss of the boy he had once been. I could mourn the relationship I thought we had. But hate? No, that wasn't mine to hold. I flipped back through earlier entries pages where my words were sharp, desperate, frantic. I remembered the nights I couldn't sleep, the mornings I doubted my own memory, the moments when I felt small enough to disappear. But those pages too were part of the story. I closed the journal gently and set it aside. Outside, the sun dipped low over the water, the last threads of daylight turning the sky to fire. I pulled on a sweater, stepped out onto the porch, and let the sea air fill my lungs. Somewhere Brandon was living with the choices he had made. Whether he would change, whether he would find his own redemption that was his path to walk, not mine to carry. I whispered softly more to the wind than to any living soul, I forgive you. Not because he deserved it, but because I deserved peace. I deserved to live the years I had left without the weight of betrayal shadowing every breath. I deserved to be more than what they tried to reduce me to. The waves rolled in steady, ancient unbroken, and I stayed there standing in the gold-tipped dusk, breathing in the salt, breathing out the past. For the first time in a long time, I felt light. I felt free. If you've stayed with me this far, there's something I want to say, something I wish someone had said to me when the ground first shifted beneath my feet. If you have ever been betrayed, ever been made to question your worth, ever felt yourself disappearing under the weight of someone else's narrative, please hear this. Your value is not determined by the eyes of others. It isn't diminished by the people who failed to see you, or by the ones who try to shape your life for their own benefit. It doesn't fade because someone labels you fragile or broken or past your prime. Your value is yours, intrinsic, unshakable. I learned this the hard way. I learned it when the people I trusted most stood in the shadows quietly rewriting the story of who they thought I had become. I learned it when my silence was mistaken for weakness, when my kindness was read as surrender. But I also learned something else. I learned that silence can be a weapon, that stillness can hold power, that the quietest voice in the room, the one inside your own chest, is often the only one that tells the truth. Now, sitting here by the window, the sound of the waves brushing against the shore, I've come to understand that life isn't about how others define you. It's about how you choose to define yourself. The sea has taught me that. It keeps moving no matter the storms, no matter the tides. It doesn't shout, it doesn't demand, it simply persists. And so do I. The golden light streams through the window pane, casting soft shadows across the worn floorboards. The air smells of salt and wildflowers, and somewhere in the distance, I can hear the faint call of seabirds over the water. This is where I found myself again, not in the fight, not in the courtroom, not even in the confrontation, but in the stillness that followed, in the choice to keep going. And if you've ever felt like you were fading, I hope you remember this. You are still here, and you are enough. The letter from Raymond rests beside me now, folded neatly, the creases soft with time. I run my fingertips across the paper, sometimes not out of grief, but out of gratitude. He saw something in me that I had forgotten. And though he's gone, his voice lingers, not just in ink and memory, but in the quiet choices I make every day to live on my own terms. The house is still. The wind carries the soft rhythm of the ocean through the open window. The sky is brushed in pinks and silvers, the day folding gently into night. I sit with a cup of tea, the steam curling upwards, the air cool against my skin. And I smile. Not because everything has been made right, some things never fully mend. Not because I've won, this was never about victory. I smile because I have chosen to live, to reclaim the chapters that were nearly stolen from me, to let go of bitterness without forgetting the lessons, to stand in the sunlight unashamed of the shadows. Somewhere Brandon walks his own road now. Whether he changes or not, whether he finds his way back to kindness that's no longer mine to carry. What I carry instead is the understanding that justice isn't always loud. It doesn't always arrive with applause or spectacle. Sometimes justice is the quiet reclaiming of your own life. Sometimes it's the simple decision to keep going, to choose peace, to build something new from the ashes of what was lost. The sea rolls on. The wind hums through the grass. And I sit here in this house by the water, my heart steady, my hands open. I close my eyes and I breathe in the salt air. I made it. Not untouched, not unchanged, but unbroken. And that is enough. Before we say goodbye, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let me know in the comments. We read every word with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. Not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Wherever you are, I hope you carry this story with you. And remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, and I'll see you in the next story.